Hi there everyone, welcome to this week's video where we're going to be discussing Patricia Hill Collins on motherhood and Black feminist theory. You might recall that earlier on in the semester we read a little bit of Patricia Hill Collins' work on intersectionality, a chapter of the book Intersectionality as Critical Social Theory. This is that's a more recent work by Collins, but Collins is an extremely prolific writer. Was really one of the first people to really give very tight sociological analysis of Black feminist theory. The selection that you're reading for this week is sort of her classic, a book of that name, just Black Feminist Theory. And it was one of the first books that was really written on this topic that approached Black feminist thinking as like an orientation for doing sociology and doing critical theory and kind of trying to understand the political world around us. So it's a really, really fascinating, super duper rich, important philosophical, sociological, and political work. So it'll really, really help us, I think, to get this sort of background that is really so vital for the development of feminist theory and activism today. So it's a really, really rich text, and I think paired in particular with Collins' piece on Black motherhood can really exemplify some of the differences in social structure between, you could say paradigmatically white women, European descent versus the situation of Black women in the United States. So I think that the piece on motherhood goes really nicely with this classic work on Black feminist theory, and I hope that it gives you rich food for thought today. So we're going to go in our normal order where we sort of have four roughly quadrants, right, on the board, and we're just going to go one by one through them. And, part of what I was saying when I said that, Collins wrote this really pioneering, super duper important work, Black feminist theory, and she was one of the first people, to take Black women's thinking seriously from both like a political and philosophical register. That's something, that she noticed in the book, right? It's not as if she is like unaware of this fact or something, right? It's actually an important aspect of Black feminist theory that it is paradigmatically, normally underappreciated, particularly by academics, philosophers, sociologists, researchers, right? It's often sort of dismissed as like niche interest or something like that. I can speak as a philosopher and say that whenever I write more contemporary things on gender and sex and sexuality and so on, it's often dismissed, right? It's sort of like, oh, that's like the feminist stuff, right? It's not like the real philosophical material, but it's instead some marginal niche specialist kind of interest. And obviously in my case that's a way to dismiss what I have to say, to dismiss kind of my work and what I'm sort of aiming towards, right? And I mean the situation is far worse for Black women, right? I mean, it's just true that if you go through most, all, or perhaps all of the requirements for a philosophy degree, then you might never read Black women in such a program, right? I think that is an injustice, right? I teach this text actually in my introduction to philosophy program class, right? But I think that this just points to the need to recognize the deep truth of what Collins is saying, which is just that Black women's intellectual labor is underappreciated and dismissed. And I certainly at this point have enough experience in my own discipline to say that that is certainly true in philosophy, right? Obviously, that's not going to be as true in a discipline like women, gender, sexuality studies, right? I mean, these departments were formed in part to do this sort of recovery work for different sort of feminist intellectual traditions, right? So obviously, this kind of research is valued in WGSS program, but then you can talk about, well, how appreciated is the WGSS program with respect to philosophy, sociology, etc., right? This was true when Collins wrote it, and it's true now, right? I think it's just a fact, right? And, there's sort of a matrix of interrelated reasons for why Black women's intellectual work is often underappreciated or dismissed or ignored, right? I mean, one of the points that she makes right away is just that Black women often have to work, right? The sort of academic positions are not available to them, right? And so oftentimes Black women's intellectual work is contained in mediums that aren't sort of traditionally recognized as being like theoretical or philosophical, right? So poetry, right, is an example. Many of the sources that Collins draws on are poets who are making important political points with their poetry, right? In a way, it's like, yes, these Black women's intellectual achievements weren't recognized because they were not allowed to be produced in the places where, you normally recognize or study intellectual texts throughout history, right? I mean, so there's just sort of the baseline in a way, totally class-based, which is not to say that race is not involved, right? Of course, race is involved. But it's to say that what's essential here is a kind of labor question, and, a question about what it is that we choose to recognize as genuine academic, intellectual work, right? Obviously, there's flat out racism, right? I mean, philosophy has a lot of that, right? I mean, there's sort of thoughts that to study philosophy is just to study European philosophy, right? And I think that philosophy has unique problems with this, but that, this is quite generally true, right? Black women were not recognized as having the capability of producing intellectual work, right? And the only thing that can explain that attitude is racism. And so as a consequence, a lot of the academic labor that exists now that is about the Black women's intellectual tradition, right, is recovery work. It's digging through archival material, right, trying to find thinkers that will otherwise sort of be erased by history and forgotten completely. This is an idea that is actually very, very old in the Black feminist tradition, right? So Patricia Collins cites Fanny Barrier Williams when she says, quote, "The colored girl is not known and hence not believed in. She belongs to a race that is designated by the term problem, and she lives beneath the shadow of that problem, which envelops and obscures her." I think that this is a really, extremely poignant description of what's going on here, right? Why it is that in sort of these more mainstream disciplines or whatever, typically Black feminist thinking is sidelined completely, right? It's considered a niche interest if it's considered acceptable at all, and there's no need for serious integration of this thinking into their curriculum or into their pedagogy or anything like that, right? And so Collins wants to go even further than this, right? It wants to say, okay, well, if you really want to explain Black women's situation, right? The way that you combine these different elements that have sort of figured into why black women were not appreciated. Well, you really need to deal with the situation of slavery in the United States, right? So here's another quote, this time directly from Collins herself, right? Quote, however, the convergence of race, class, and gender oppression characteristic of U.S. slavery shaped all subsequent relationships that women of African descent within black American families and communities, I think a missing word maybe, have with employers and amongst one another. It also created the context for black women's political work, right? So I want to emphasize that this is a really strong claim, right, that Collins is making. I mean, she says shaped all subsequent relationships that women of African descent in black American families have with themselves, with their communities, their employers, and amongst one another. So that, it is a very strong claim. And moreover, we can see a kind of anticipation of intersectional themes, right? I mean, one thing that many intersectional feminists note, which is just that many of the ideas of intersectional feminism are really anticipated in the black women's intellectual tradition for like hundreds of years, right? So, I mean, even here we have a discussion of the convergence of race, class, and gender oppression, and that, ultimately these structures were fundamental to U.S. slavery, and that situation of United States slavery ends up shaping the entire, right, black women's intellectual tradition. Hence, many of the most important works in black feminist theory are concerned with the situation of black women slaves, or with the sort of social, political, spiritual afterlife of United States slavery in either in one context or another, right? So, for Collins, then U.S. slavery sort of gives you a basis of unity in a sense, right? It's the cause of the situation that all of these black women political theorists are sort of responding to, right? It's the context for black women's political work in the United States. So, I think here we have another case where we need to talk about how the entire American project, right? I mean, it's rooted in colonialism, transatlantic slave trade, and I mean, the fact that this shapes, on Collins' view, all of the subsequent relationships that black women have is really, really striking, right? I mean, it's kind of incredible that as a country we continue to talk about slavery in the sort of blasé way that we do, where we just say that it happened, some hundreds of years ago, and we act like it's, unrelated to current situation. It's, the sins of the father and so on, right? When really, I think what Collins would want to emphasize from the black feminist perspective is just that, yes, of course, the direct situation of chattel slavery is mostly over in the United States, right? But I mean, the economic and political situation that it produced continues to exist today, right? So I think that this gives us an opportunity to transition over to the second piece from Collins that I wanted us to read and tackle together for this week, which is on black feminist conceptions of motherhood, right? So, I mean, one of the lessons I think that we should get from the Collins piece is that we misunderstand the structure of women's oppression if we're only examining the situation of white women, right? And so part of the reason why Collins, I think, is motivated to write this piece on motherhood is because she reads, some, you could say, like classical feminist texts on motherhood, right? And finds that it doesn't resonate with her at all, right? So what are we to do about that, right? How can we, in a way, sort of like recover this sort of alternative conception of motherhood that Collins thinks exemplifies the situation of Black women, right, rather than traditionally white European women. So I've drawn up a little kind of chart here. The details are not so important, but I think it provides a nice basis of comparison between Collins' account of Black women in the United States and their conception of motherhood, right, with, you could say, just a white European feminist conception of motherhood, right, that we could find in figures like Simone de Beauvoir. So we didn't really read this Beauvoir stuff, so you're kind of just take it on trust, right, that I'm correctly characterizing Beauvoir's account of motherhood in The Second Sex, right? But ultimately, it doesn't really matter, right? She's just sort of like, in this case, a kind of representative for white feminist thinking about motherhood roughly in the 20th century, right? And I think, if we go back to the previous quadrant, right, we think about what it is that Collins said about how slavery shaped all subsequent relationships with Black women, right, then that will obviously give us a clue for how we're going to think about motherhood on her account, right? So, I mean, one thing to say is just that Beauvoir's account is much more structured around, you could say, the nuclear family, right? So Beauvoir thinks about families as being like, we have a mother, a father, and children, right? Nuclear family is typically like 2 children or something like that, right? But the point here is just that motherhood is a singular role, and that role is for the biological mother. And the biological mother carries after the domestic duties of the household, right? So she doesn't have to work, right? She's raising children, right? That's sort of Beauvoir's account of mothers, in Europe at this time. And Beauvoir, if you read The Second Sex, clearly has a very, very antagonistic relationship with her mother, right? And in fact, she sort of conceives of her mother as a kind of enemy for feminists, right? And you might be like, well, why does she think that? Well, it's because mothers have sort of the duty or the obligation of transmitting gender roles. So I don't know if this experience will resonate with very many of you, but I think that it's often said in sort of feminist theory, right, that mothers are sometimes some of the harshest of gender critics, right? Mothers will tell their daughters that they're failing to perform their gender correctly or adequately, right? They will seek to correct their daughters, right? They see it as, in a certain way, their duty to figure out how to convey appropriate aspects of womanhood to their daughters, so that they can survive in the world. And so in many ways, Beauvoir describes mothers as almost like the prison guards of patriarchy, right? On the one hand, like, they are fellow prisoners. They are also, I mean, part of what mothers convey to their daughters is how much they've been hurt by the, kind of life that they've been resigned towards living. But on the other hand, mothers are, on Beauvoir's account, like, ready to prepare their daughters to live through the same kind of life, right? So Beauvoir very often portrays the mother as the enforcer of patriarchal gender expectations, and therefore a daughter's sort of rebellion against her mother as like a sort of feminist rite of passage, right? And part of the reason why Beauvoir thinks of this as like a kind of awakening for adolescent women is that motherhood is supposed to be private and apolitical. You can think back to our discussion of like Pateman, right? So, fathers are typically seen as heads of household and therefore the legal representative of the family in all public affairs, right? That's why men have to work, right? Whereas women are sort of on this arrangement consigned to the private sphere and are, therefore view themselves as fundamentally apolitical, right? They're not sort of the representation of their household. They're not supposed to take a stand on political matters, right? And so Beauvoir sort of characterizes an adolescent, early adult daughter sort of rising up against her mother as coming into a kind of feminist consciousness, right? And I think that even though this narrative is somewhat specific to Beauvoir, that it describes an experience that many women go through, right? Not even just white women or something like that. It might be more common in the situation of white women, right? But why? Well, I mean, part of what we can see here is that families are divided up into households, and households are held together on Beauvoir's account through a single income, right? Namely, the father's income, right? I mean, that's just part of what is entailed by this sort of nuclear family conception, right? Whereas, I mean, Collins sort of describes paradigmatic examples of Black family life is not really confined to this sort of nuclear structure, right? I mean, part of the difference is that, it was often the case for Black families that she was writing about that both the mother and the father have to work to support the family, right? So this sort of neat division for white European families, this division of labor where men are public and they're the earners and women are private and they're domestic and so on, right? That structure is not really plausible for very many number of Black families that Collins is looking at, right? So, you start out by being like, okay, well, if that's the case, then motherhood is no longer really sort of like an individual role that's filled by the biological mother as being sort of like head of the domestic sphere, right? Instead, for Black families, motherhood is sort of complex caretaking structure, right? I mean, the fact that mothers like can't be around all the time like just means that you need a cousin, an aunt, someone, grandma, right? To take care of children, right? And so as a consequence, and also as a consequence, Collins says, of the ghettoization of Black women, right, is that they're often proximate to larger family structures, right? They can rely on other family members, perhaps, to take care of their kids while they have to work and so on, right? And so, whereas the sort of like white European experience of motherhood is that you have a single mother, this mother's with you all the time, and she's telling you how you need to be. In this case, right, you have a lot of women that will often play the role of caretaker, right? It's sort of more of a social structure of caretaking than it is anything like a single uniform phenomena. And consequently, mothers, and Collins talks about this term other mothers, right? So mothers, people that play a sort of caretaking, raising role, child rearing role in someone's life, right, that aren't the biological mother, Collins says, okay, we can call these other mothers because they're relatively durable, social relationships that are associated with child rearing practices that, in white European culture, we just think of as being motherhood, right? So, on this account, right, mothers embody a kind of social knowledge and survival, right? I mean, you're facing the same situation. You have this constellation of women, oftentimes, that are looking after you and raising you, and in this case, they are women that have learned to deal with great kinds of hardship, right? And so oftentimes the relationship, at least as Collins describes it, is much more conciliatory than the situation that Beauvoir describes, right? And whereas in the Beauvoir case, you have like a single mother that's sort of like the paradigm of motherhood, right? Or at least knows what the paradigm of motherhood is. This sort of motherhood as a social structure model in Black American families lets a number of women sort of play this mothering role with children, right? And children therefore can learn that there are lots of different ways that you can be a mother, or lots of different ways that you can live and survive and thrive as a Black woman, right? And so as a consequence, right, there's much less of this sort of gender jailer situation that goes on here, right? It's not as important in this context that that you reproduce a sort of nuclear family, right? And so consequently, whereas Beauvoir conceived of motherhood as private and apolitical, Collins points out that within Black American families, motherhood is often seen as a kind of source of political strength, right? I mean, your convictions that a better world is possible, desirable, and necessary oftentimes can really come from the fact that you have someone that is going to live in that world, and that you have an extreme stake in it, and you have a desire to make the world better than it otherwise would be. And a lot of Black feminist theorists therefore will talk about how their politics is motivated by a kind of love, right? A kind of revolutionary love. It's not love for someone insofar as they fulfill certain kinds of gender expectations, but a love that wants them to thrive for their own sake. So we will leave it there. That is Patricia Collins on motherhood and Black feminist theory. I hope that you enjoyed this video. I very much look forward to what you have to say, and I'll see you in the next one.